make sure to give my dad a 5-star review.
Make sure to like and subscribe to his YouTube. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Well, in a small way, as much as I can, I want to stick up for separation of church and state. I really think that that's the American way. I think when you go back and you do look at the history, you see there was the Winthrop way, the Puritan way. They came here and they were looking for religious community for themselves. And the dissenters either got banished or killed or maimed. And that's not the world I want to live in. I don't want that for my kids.
Well, hey there, guys. Welcome to Church and State 250. This is a series from Faithful Politics where we're taking a step back and looking at how faith has shaped America and American public life, especially over the past 250 years. And I'm your faithful host here, Josh Burtram. Of course, we have our political host that's always with us, Wright. And in this episode, we're going to focus on some of those common claims about America's religious founding and to see how they hold up when we actually go back to the original primary sources. We're big fans of primary sources here on Faithful Politics. What did the founders say? How did they write it into law? And how have these ideas been reinterpreted or misinterpreted over time? Today, we're joined by Warren Throckmorton. He's a researcher and author who spent years digging into the historical record, fact-checking claims about the founding and examining how figures like Thomas Jefferson are often quoted and especially misquoted and used in today's debates. His work helps bring clarity to a conversation that's often driven more by repetition than actual evidence. So he's the author of multiple books, including Getting Jefferson Right, fact-checking claims about our third president, as well as The Christian Past That Wasn't, debunking the Christian nationalist myths that hijack history, which we talked about with him about on this program. So thank you so much, Warren, for coming on and spending time with us. And we'd love for you to actually just introduce yourself and maybe even tell our audience a little bit about your work and what brought you to this.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me on again. Enjoyed my last time with you and looking forward to today. I probably was drawn to this in kind of an indirect way, I guess, as I think I said on the last time I was with you. I became aware of claims about history through a fellow named Brian Fisher. He was one of the gateways into this, but also through David Barton. But even before that, I've always enjoyed history. My father was a history teacher, and I always taught my psychology classes from the lens of the historical background of the subject, whatever that psychology subject was. But through a variety of circumstances, it started to really occur to me that there was this movement that we now call Christian nationalism, wasn't called so much that back then, that wanted to use the government as a source of power to create laws that reflected, at the time my focus was Old Testament law. And that was going on around the world. There were nations in Africa that were, for instance, putting forth laws that would have criminalized homosexuality. And, whatever you think of that subject or whatever you think of homosexuality, I didn't think that criminalizing consensual behavior made any sense, whether you thought it was, morally proper or not. And if that's what a Christian nation, was all about, I didn't want any part of that. And I started to look at who was behind these kind of proposals or suggestions that civil law should reflect Old Testament law. And, some names kept coming up. David Barton was one, and Ruchus J. Rushdoony was another one. And just this whole movement of that we now call Christian nationalism just really began to concern me. And so I started to, explore these claims and some of the historical stories that were used to support these claims. And that really got me into fact checking. Like, I wanted to know, were these historical claims true? Did the founders really want a Christian republic? And because, from my history classes and so forth, I thought we had a Christian heritage. I knew there was a lot of religion in,
Yes.
our background, but I didn't really feel that fit with the First Amendment. And so anyway, that's what got me really started in this. And that was back in around 2010 or 11. And it's just become kind of a passion, really, to
And it's just gotten
to
so
do
much
that.
better since then, hasn't it, Warren? I mean, everything's just fine. Nobody cares about this stuff anymore. It's just
No,
like,
it's not at all every day, every hour news,
crazy.
Warren, so this episode is airing in July, and if I were a betting man, somebody probably doesn't have to go very far to see imagery or depictions of an American history that more closely aligns with religion than probably you would agree with. So like when somebody makes a claim, America was founded as a Christian nation, like what's kind of the first step in kind of unpacking that claim? Like what's the process by which you go through to sort of determine whether or not, a claim is factual or not?
Well, that's a deceptively difficult question always, it seems to me, because you have to define terms. So the first thing I like to do whenever I'm in a discussion about that is, what do you mean by Christian nation? Do you mean a nation full of Christians, a majority of the population being Christian? Is that what you mean? Do you mean that the culture of those people is primarily Christian? What is it you mean? Or do you mean that the system of government is obligated in some way to reflect Christianity when you say Christian nation? As in some other nations, maybe an Islamic nation, where by constitution, the laws are required to reflect Islam. Well, if that's what you mean, then it's fairly easy to go to our charter documents and just take a look. Do they require subservience to Christianity, any form of it, or not? And when you go to our Constitution, you don't even see the mention of God. And the only mention of religion you see is to say no religious test shall be required for service in the government. So, but you could count up the number of people and their religion and see that, Christianity there's a lot of Christians here. And so from that point of view, you might be able to make a case that way. And I think every non-Christian, when all the Christian holidays are celebrated, and when the Christian culture is just accepted as normal by most everybody, they'll say, yeah, this is a Christian nation. A lot of non-Christians say that right away. Of course it's a Christian nation. What do you mean? What are you even asking? But when it comes to the system of government we have, what is required in law? Well, it's pretty easy for me, at least, and this is where the rub and the arguments, come about, is to say, no, we don't. We have a secular government which allows for freedom of religious expression.
Well, so I love that. And one of the things that always interests me when we're talking about this stuff, because people are making all sorts of claims, like David Barton, right? This is someone that we've talked about quite a bit. It's someone like on this program we know, and Rushdoony, but even with David Barton, the claims that he's making about covenants that the United States might have with God, about the inspiration behind the Constitution, biblical inspiration at some level, or like, right, not that it's, well, he might think it's kind of inspired. I'm actually not totally sure what he thinks about that, but at least that it was withdrawn from the Christian scriptures almost explicitly. And so you have all these claims that are made, and someone hears this and they hear they're at church and they hear David Barton or a video from David Barton in a small group say, hey, you know, our Constitution was based on the Bible. And then they hear this weird pastor gone woke, Josh Burtram, talking to Warren Throckmorton and the completely hopeless Will Wright, who's been so left and liberal, no one can listen to anything he said. So we look at them and they're making the claim that it's much more complicated than that and actually isn't at all inspired as to be a Christian nation in the way that they might be thinking of it. How does someone distinguish between those claims? I know we've been talking about this, but just to get very clear, how can I know whether you're right or whether David Barton is right? How do we take a historical approach to these claims?
That's such a great question because that's where so many people are. They're absolutely in that point of tension. I do talk about that a good bit in the book, that the psychological needs that are met by being in a community are threatened when you know the truth, when you know the facts about the beginning of the nation, and then you're in a group like that, just like you described, and people are saying the Constitution was based on the Bible, and what do you do? Well, how do you find out? Well, you go back to the sources. I'm going to beat the drum, and you do. I know you guys do this. Beat the drum for primary sources, and finding those is a matter of becoming literate about where to find them on the internet. But I just challenge any of your listeners. Sometime when you have a lot of time, go read the minutes of the Constitutional Convention. It's about 900 pages. So you're going to need to spread it out. I did it in 2 summers, basically did it like devotions. I started in May and then went through daily every day till September when the delegates, signed off on the Constitution. I just read the minutes every day. I did that the first time in, I think it was 2017, because David Barton had said to a couple of churches that the clauses of the Constitution were based on certain Bible verses. And he had he has a graphic and he has the clause and the Bible verse next to each other. And he said they're almost verbatim. And in a couple of times he said they are verbatim. Like the clause in the Constitution is verbatim what the Bible says. Well, you're never going to find that. But I thought, well, let me go read the minutes, the notes of the debates of the delegation or the delegates. Let me see just how much they referred to the Bible. And, lo and behold, they didn't. And you wouldn't know that unless you read it yourself. I mean, you wouldn't believe it necessarily. But, I had to say, he said all that stuff about the Constitution came right from the Bible and the delegates used the Bible to form the Constitution. And I just didn't think that was true just from reading the Constitution. I know it wasn't verbatim because you can compare the two and know that. But I thought, well, maybe there's some, something in the discussions. One preacher that I talk about in my book, he said that the delegates, when they were really struggling over something, they just threw up their hands and they said, "What saith the Lord?" And, then they stopped and they tried to figure out what the Bible said about it. Well, they didn't do that. Nowhere did they say, "What saith the Lord?" And you would know that if you read the primary source. But, a lot of these fellows who say these things, they are pretty sure that their audience is not going to go read 900 pages of James Madison's best prose. They're just not going to do it. But you should.
That's so funny because I'm not going to read 900 pages either. so like, and I've read David Barton's stuff and I'm like, I don't know. I'm leaning more towards trusting Warren Throckmorton than I am, other people, because I've read your works also, and reading other people's works confirms the things that you put in your work. Mm-hmm. So it's almost like, yeah, I would have a harder time debunking the stuff that you write than the stuff that David Barton writes. And I know that one of the things that he does write, because I've seen it, like in the America Praise documentation and whatnot, is this idea of prayer that took place at the Constitutional Convention, and more specifically a prayer by Benjamin Franklin, I believe. And I love if you could just unpack that for me, because I think that's a story that we hear quite a bit, and I think it'd be one just for folks to know what the real facts are.
Right, June 28th, 1787, Ben Franklin, at near the end of the session. They'd been bickering over lots of things, the delegates had been, and Ben Franklin stands up. Well, whether he stood up or not, he signaled that he wanted to speak. And he essentially gave a request, a motion, that the delegation, the convention, begin every day with prayer. He said that during the Revolution, we called on God to help us. And have we now forgotten the aid that we received from God? And here we have not done that, which, just as an aside, think about that a minute. If the Constitutional Convention was so based on God and based on the Bible, well, at least up to then it wasn't, because he said, we haven't done it, fellas. We haven't been praying. We haven't been using religion because I'm calling you to do it. And so he did that. He called them to prayer, made a motion that they have somebody lead a prayer every morning before they start their business. Well, Roger Sherman, I believe it was, from Connecticut, one of the evangelical delegates, seconded the motion. They started to have discussion. Another one of some of the delegates gave reasons why they hadn't done it. Another delegate made a motion that maybe what they should do instead is have a sermon over the 4th of July break. And then after that, they could start having daily prayers. But here's the upshot. The upshot of the thing is that they never voted on the motion. They found ways to get around it so they could adjourn. And there's some hint in Madison's writing later that maybe it went to a committee. But again, the upshot was they never did it. It was never voted on one way or the other. And so it never happened. And Ben Franklin later in his diary recorded that only 3 or 4 of the delegates thought prayer necessary. Now, it's really hard for me to think that was a convention full, or a bunch of delegates that wanted to have a Christian country, if they couldn't even agree to have prayer every morning, when Ben Franklin, somebody who called himself, who wasn't at all Orthodox, was calling them to prayer. And so they didn't do it. But when you have Christian nationalists telling the story, often you'll have them say that they stopped and prayed right then for hours. Many tellings of
until
the story,
they got revelation.
And until, yes, at least either they got revelation or until the Constitutional Convention was rescued from all the bickering and all of the disagreements. And that's commonly what the story is used to do, is to say that the convention was going to break up. But when Ben Franklin called to pray, then everybody got mellow, everybody got sweet on each other, and there weren't any more disagreements. And then they put together the Constitution that we all live by now, and it was God that did it. But you know what that overlooks is the fact that they hadn't even talked about the 3/5 compromise yet. They hadn't even they had talked about slavery some, but they had a lot more to say. Some of the delegates didn't even sign the Constitution. Does that sound like a unified, sweet bunch of guys? that said, "Oh, we're all coming together now, kumbaya."
Stay with us. We'll be right back.
Women were vital to the history of American Christianity. But now growing numbers of women are quitting the church over misogyny, abuse, racism, homophobia, and the big banner that seems to connect it all, Christian nationalism. I'm Sarah Stancorp, and my new book, Damned If She Does, is about why millions of American women have quit church and what it means for the future. Keep listening at the end of this episode for an exclusive Faithful Politics sneak peek.
No, it does not sound like that to me. And obviously, I don't think it probably sounds like that to most people who are listening, and then accept the narrative, right, that you're bringing, which I believe is the correct one, right?
Yeah.
The messy one, the one where they came there and they're trying to forge this nation out of disparate and diverse agendas, ideas, people. Obviously, they were white and male, so that diversity wasn't there, but the diversity in where they may even see the nation going, and they had to come together and try to form this thing. And it was difficult and it was messy, and it wasn't we always try to put in this interesting narrative to clean things up after the fact, which might speak to our, some need in our human psyche. And you're welcome to talk about that. But what I really want to what I think is really important in this whole conversation is that, especially when people are saying, hey, this was a Christian nation. They wanted it as a Christian nation from the beginning, right? Which is kind of the premise that we are, for lack of a better term, attacking right now, argumentatively, to try to say, hey, or stress testing, like like you said, like what do we mean it was a Christian nation? A bunch of Christian people, Christian heritage, Christian influence. Okay, like specifically bringing in laws from the Bible into this nation, and people might think, yeah, it was made this way. And yet there's two things that are really important that you point out in your work that I would love for you to talk about. The fact that it doesn't mention God, the Constitution, and the fact that there is an explicit rejecting of a religious test for office, which was an intentional detachment or movement away from the trend that they had or from what the reality was maybe in the colonies, right, where there were those kinds of things. Can you explain the significance of that and why God hasn't mentioned the Constitution and the rejecting of religious tests and how that kind of militates against this idea of a Christian nation at its founding?
Sure. It is remarkable when you think about it. Here were all of these religious men. They were, most of them, I believe, members of Christian churches. Now, they weren't all Orthodox. Many of them were Unitarian leaning, Universalists. They were rationalistic in their Christianity. There were certainly some that were Orthodox. But they would have thought of themselves as religious. They came together and they didn't mention God. What in the world? And so that's the thing to pay attention to. And so they didn't mention God. And in fact, they said that there shall be no test, no religious test. Now, that's another thing that's unusual because many of the states or the colonies and then the states, once independence was gained, had tests that were religious in nature. They had in their constitutions, you had to believe in God to hold an office in the state, or in some states you had to be a member of the state church. Now, why didn't they take that into the federal government? There are some theories that people offer that indicate that they were trying to protect their state establishments, but whatever the theories are, they didn't do it at the federal level. I rather think that they saw that those oaths really didn't help very much. I mean, there were people at the convention that had taken those test oaths in their states, but they didn't mean it. They didn't believe in a triune God. They were Unitarian oriented. I'm thinking of John Adams. I'm thinking of, John Adams didn't believe in the Trinity. So you have this religious group of people, and they came together and they did not create a religious document. That's pretty amazing just on the surface of it. And so what it does is it creates a secular government. It creates a government that can never really be a Christian nation because you can't have control over who is in the government. There's no religious test. You could have people with no religion or any of the other religions. It's not about denominations of Christianity that they really were saying that there was no test of denominational difference. That's not it. They knew the difference between Christianity and religion. In fact, in the ratifying conventions, it was very clear that the delegates understood a pagan could be elected. They said these words: Hindus, Mohammedans, or Muslims, people of other religions besides Christianity could be elected. In fact, it was a big part of the ratifying debates. People wanted to know, what do you really mean here? And those defending the Constitution were very clear about that. So it was very significant and very meaningful, the things that you're bringing out. No mention of God and the no religious test clause. And they did that in the context of the states having very different approaches. Now, one last thing. Over the course of time, states started doing away with those things too. Once the federal Constitution came in place, by 1833, the states had disestablished their state churches. So what was the trend? The trend was toward disestablishment.
I want to switch over to Jefferson because I know that you've done quite a bit of writing and research on Jefferson, but also he's a bit of a popular character in a lot of folks' minds, especially if they have equated, some religious origin to the country's founding. So, number one, I'd love just for you to kind of talk about like what's so special about Thomas Jefferson, and you also wrote a book about him. I'd love for you to just kind of talk about like, why did you write a book about him?
Well, the book was in response to David Barton's book, The Jefferson Lies. And when I knew that his book was coming out, I requested an advance copy of it. I had already done some fact-checking of claims that David Barton had made relating to Jefferson. And so I wanted to see, did he keep those same claims in this book? This was back in 2011, 2012. His book came out in 2012. Michael Coulter and my book came out just about a month after his did. Now, it was just an ebook at the time. We didn't have all the fact checks in it that we eventually would have in the paperback book. And we have a lot more now in the third edition of the book. But we focused on Jefferson and have continued to some degree because, everybody wants the main founders on their team. George Washington, Madison, Adams, and Jefferson. Jefferson is also important because he said those words, wall of separation between church and state. And Christian nationalists, obviously, they have some trouble with that. And they would like to reframe the meaning of the wall of separation between church and state. So they don't like Jefferson on that point. They like Jefferson, though, on the point of him writing the Declaration of Independence. He does mention God in the Declaration, and they really would like him to be Orthodox. At the time he wrote that, because then that would argue a little bit more, for the idea that he was referring to Jehovah when he's talking about God. I remember Charlie Kirk saying that the declaration reads like a prayer, like in Revelation. Well, sorry to disappoint the folks that believe that, but Jefferson was not Orthodox when he wrote the Declaration, and he certainly would never have thought that anything in Revelation was scriptural. He thought Revelation was the book of Revelation was the ravings of a madman.
Well, Warren, real fast, when you talk about Orthodox, can you just kind of clarify what that means? Because if somebody's watching this and, they have no religious upbringing and they hear Orthodox or, Trinitarian or, all these other terms. Yeah.
Okay. Well, Orthodox essentially means they believe the supernatural claims of Christianity, that Jesus was God, that he was born of a virgin, that he died for our sins, rose again the third day, and then ascended into heaven, that he did miracles when he was on earth to validate his position as the Messiah, the Savior of the world, and that redemption only comes through Christ, exclusively through Christ. Jefferson was not an Orthodox Christian. He did not believe that Jesus was God. He did not believe in the resurrection. Now, he did believe in a judgment after death. He did believe in a God, kind of vague in the sense of that term, but he did not believe in Jehovah. He thought the Old Testament was full of problems, thought the Old Testament God was vindictive and cruel. He didn't have a lot of good things to say about the Apostle Paul or the New Testament epistles. He didn't, in fact, while he was in the White House, he took the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and he cut out the supernatural elements, so like the miracles and the resurrection. He just cut those out. Can you imagine if a president now did that, or, I just see Barack Obama doing that, and oh, well, my goodness, just think of
recording this way before July, so there's a long period. A lot can happen.
Yeah, okay. Well, practically speaking, I think a lot of these folks just cut out all the Bible. But anyway, that's free for coming.
Yes.
But so he cut this stuff out and he made his own little gospel booklet. All right. David Barton says that he made that to give to Indian missionaries so he could evangelize them. That's just one of the tall tales, that we talked about in our book, refuting that. There's no evidence that he ever gave that little book to anybody. In fact, he offered to give it to Benjamin Rush just to look at it. And Rush said, look, if it's not Orthodox, in other words, if Jesus isn't God in this thing, I don't want to see it. And so Jefferson never gave it to him because Jefferson cut out all the indicators of Jesus' divinity in his treatment of this. So that's what I mean by, Orthodox. And, Jefferson wasn't. But the project of people who believe in a Christian America is to make the founders look as much like today's evangelicals as possible. And that's another way of thinking when I say Orthodox. I mean, like today's evangelicals. They want to draw a through line from the founders to today's evangelicals so we can all be on the same team.
Yeah, I've seen that, and I've definitely experienced that. And I want to push into the idea of the selective use of Jefferson, right? So there's certain things that they love about it, like, the Declaration of Independence that he said to our creator, like there were endowed by certain rights. Even the idea that you mentioned, Charlie Kirk saying it's reading like a prayer. And then, the idea that, and then the thing that they don't like of the separation of church and state in this letter to the Danbury, and Danbury Baptists. And so it's like, but this whole thing is surrounding this idea that there's this selective use of history, almost a cherry picking. And of course, we get this all the time in the Bible, right? Where there's cherry picking the people, not in the Bible, but people's use of the Bible rather, is that there's cherry picking all the time, right? Certain verses, even segments of verses, things like that. And it's amazing with all those words, you can get the Bible to say a whole lot of things if you're selectively using it, right? And not seeing its general trend, right? It's trajectory towards mercy and peace, and its trend towards what God is doing, and you see the whole story. Well, I think there's probably something similar in America, and even similar probably with Jefferson. I'm just wondering, like, in the sense that, like, there is a trajectory, and picking and cherry picking things out of his life, you can try to put a narrative that actually isn't representing who he is. So what would you say, what are Jefferson's actual writings and actions, like, how do they actually shape, would you say, or should shape our understanding of church-state separation? How should Jefferson be used?
Well, I think he's an important thinker when it comes to separation of church and state. He made that a focus of his energy. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, for instance, that was one of the things he wanted on his tombstone. He was critically concerned with freedom of conscience and wrote a good bit about that. He differed and varied from, let's say, George Washington on the matter of prayer proclamations. Washington, of course, issued a prayer proclamation for Thanksgiving, at Thanksgiving, and called the nation to prayer. Jefferson declined to do that and laid out a case for why it was unconstitutional to do that. Now, he's the third president. There's a term between him. Adams also did that. Adams later regretted it. In fact, Adams said that's probably what turned me out of office was his prayer. Yes, his prayer proclamation. But, Washington did it. Adams did it, said it, probably hurt him. Jefferson came along and said that this is not something that the chief magistrate of the nation should do. You shouldn't try to set any kind of restriction or boundary or anything when it comes to religious observance. That's up to the religious bodies to do that. But, that's kind of a bold move. Washington, even at Jefferson's time, was very popular. And so he staked out territory to say that the federal government should not be involved in that. So he clearly had a position on the subject. He had views that he articulated over and over again when it came to the separation of church and state. And he was one, he along with Madison, I think, are the two thinkers that really undergird the more firm separationist position. And I think those of us who, strongly believe in a separation of church and state and the value of that, over and over again, go back to Jefferson and Madison in particular.
So I've been a Christian since 2008, and I can honestly say I've never once fact-checked a prayer that somebody has given. But I know that prayers, especially from the founders, or at least alleged from that time period, are used sometimes to kind of reinforce, this Christian nation narrative. I'd love for us to just kind of focus on one in particular that I know you've written about at Cape Henry, in particular. So could you kind of like give us the the summary of what is the Cape Henry prayer that people tend to point to, and what's the real story behind it?
Well, when some Englishmen came to the continent, I want to say 1607. I'm not sure I got the date just right there, but they landed just outside of what would be Jamestown. So they landed at Cape Henry, and they did erect a wooden cross this party of Englishmen, explorers. There was a chaplain, Reverend Hunt, who was on board, although he had been very sick. It's a little hard to tell from the narrative whether he was still sick when they landed or not. But at any rate, the legend is that he said a dedicatory kind of prayer when they erected the cross. And, that was pretty much it. But what you're referring to is the fact that in a government document that is out this year to commemorate the, America 250, the prayer is included in the government document. The problem is nobody knows what the prayer was, if he even said a prayer. Now, we do know this cross was erected. That's in the primary source. But Christian Nation advocates have just gone beyond the narrative and added this prayer. Somebody along the way added a prayer, and now just about any time that you talk about America as a covenant nation, this prayer comes up. And in the White House document that you're talking about, they acknowledge that we may not have the exact prayer or something like that. We don't have the exact prayer, but they list it anyway. They print it anyway, as if maybe it could be. Well, somebody obviously made it up along the way because they wanted it to be a little more dramatic than just, well, maybe they prayed, maybe they didn't. This is so typical of to just make stuff up and to try to embellish the narrative to make it more fitting.
And the explanation, just like that, how do you explain it? Is it just the motivation is pure, like, maybe I shouldn't say pure anything, but is it they just want power? Like they literally, like someone made it up along the way and then other people like gave into it and they didn't want to check it. Maybe they thought it might be, but they just didn't really want to do it because it, gave them what they wanted. Like, how do you make, and I'm asking a question that you probably can't answer, right? Totally, right? Because you can't see everyone's soul and all that stuff. But
right.
What gives, I guess? What do you think? Is it purely power in your opinion on this?
I think it's different in different cases. In the new book, I have, for instance, tracking down a quote of Madison's that ended up in a Louisiana state law. Well, the Ten Commandments law, they misquote Madison, make up a quote. And I trace it backwards, where it came from.
That's really bad.
Yeah. And, that one, I think is like telephone, the game of telephone where you say something and then by the time it gets to the end of the string or the end of the chain of people, it sounds like something else. I think that you can have, kind of honest mistakes that go along with various stories. But sometimes you do. You just have somebody made up a story to kind of like preachers do sometimes. They'll tell a story to illustrate a point, but the story's not real. Now, I don't frankly like that. I think that's, that's bad preaching. If you don't have true stories, don't make one up. But a lot of preachers do that, but they do it for dramatic
they're being
effect.
Like Jesus. It's like a parable. Oh, wait, but they don't actually say a parable, though. Do they say
exactly. They present it like it's the real thing. And that's what happens.
That's not good.
This prayer might have at some point been like that. It could have been like this.
Right.
Maybe he said this or something like it. And then the next person comes along and doesn't get that part. They just take the prayer and say, oh, this must be what he said. And throughout the course of our history, various standards of documentation, have changed. We're much better now, I think, at footnoting and demanding that we have primary sources. The historians of former eras weren't quite as exacting. And you see a lot of times in old documents, you'll see various quotes and so forth. There's no source whatsoever. It's very hard to track some of that stuff down.
So there's a problem with almost like the methodology changing, where really that the expectations and standards change, and then that drives the methodology, or maybe it's a cyclical process, right? I'm not sure if the expectations drive the method, or just advances in method drive expectations, or probably I guess it's some of the, like, both ways is my guess on that one. But thinking about the 1774 prayer, so I think that's one of the things, like, when I'm thinking about this, like this whole Continental Congress prayer, I want you to address that one, because that's one of those ones that, like, well, look, they did it at the Continental Congress. I mean, how can you say? So could you kind of help us understand what happened 1774 Continental Congress, and why is that a good example of some kind of unity around a Christian ideal, or is it a bad example, and why?
Well, Jacob Duché was a minister who prayed in 1774, and he prayed a unifying prayer. It was a prayer apparently that got a lot of people's emotions stirred up, and it was in favor of independence. Now, what happened afterwards is rarely discussed among Christian nationalists. He later became a loyalist. He later decided he was wrong to support independence. And so he actually wrote George Washington a letter and urged him to basically call off the revolution. So he became a loyalist, and it wasn't quite as popular after that. So it doesn't really change the fact that he, prayed in a civil, place, or in a political place. I would always point out, I always like to point out that any of these stories that take place before the Constitution was ratified and the Bill of Rights was ratified, to me, it's less influential as a support for mixing church and state, because we didn't have the First Amendment. We didn't have the Constitution until we did, and so anything that that Congress did, or the president did, or, any of the leaders did that mixed church and state, well, there was a transitional period between the colonial governments, which were colonies of Great Britain, that had a state church. I mean, you think about the sea change that takes place between colonial state church oriented thinking and governments, and the kind of constitution that we have, where, again, God is not mentioned, there's no religious test, and then the First Amendment, which says no state church, and Congress shall make no law, and everybody can worship freely the way they want to. That's a huge change from one paradigm to another paradigm. So, of course, there are going to be glitches. There are going to be some people really want a state church, and they're going to say things and do things that maybe isn't consistent with the Constitution. Just because some founder said or did something doesn't mean that is in the clear for everybody else to do it or say it, or it was correct. I mean, we've got a lot of people running around saying things today in politics and in the government. Are you going to say that everything they do and say is precedent for the next day or the next year or 10 years from now? I doubt it.
Let's hope not.
Yeah. Warren, one of the things I like the most about your writing, especially in your latest book, The Christian Past I Wasn't, was you draw a little bit from your background in psychology. So I'd love for you to kind of help us understand, like, why are these narratives so powerful? True or not? like what about them? What about the country being founded as a Christian nation? Is almost like part of the DNA of some people in the country. Like, I'd love for you to just kind of help us make sense of all this, because, somebody watching or listening to this is like, well, the truth is right there. He just told us. He read 900 pages. You can go read 900 pages, and compare notes. Like, the answer is there, So, like, why is there a disconnect? I'd love for you just to, bring some sanity to the conversation.
People are often afraid of change. They're afraid when there's social change. They're concerned when the country doesn't seem to be stable. Every day there seems to be something worrying about the news. And in conditions like that, people want stability. They want to look for something that ties them to a stable existence. And research is pretty clear about this. When you remind people of, or when you can incite anxiety in research subjects, they become more nationalistic. They become, I mean, a lot of things can happen actually, but one of the things that researchers find is that they become more attached to traditional views of their country, of their people. And Gordon Allport, many years ago, found that we tend to be attracted to people who are like us. And this is a search for safety, a search for a way to address our fears. Now, that's one side of it, the security that comes from belonging. Another side is to try to address fear. And I think a lot of this is rooted in fear, is power. And I think Christian nationalism really speaks to that. If you can be in the in group, if you can be in the group that's in power, if you can be in the group that's in the majority, then if you don't think the leopard will eat your face, if you can be in a group that prevents that, you might be better off. I mean, anything that will help you survive is something of attraction, will attract you. And those are the three factors I talk about in the book is fear, identity, and power. Fear seems to be at the root of what drives a lot of people, and they either seek identification with majority or they seek to gain power over the minority. And boy, we have just daily, it seems like, our fears are stoked against the other, the immigrant, the minority. And I think that's what drives a lot of Christians. That there's a study I talk about in the book where Christians are told by researchers that they will soon be in the minority. Christians will no longer be in the majority. And that just that reminder, just that suggestion by a researcher makes the subjects more nationalistic. And so
I'm really not surprised by that.
Okay. Well,
I'm just not surprised. I mean, I it stinks, but I'm just not surprised by it. I don't know. Are you surprised by it, Warren? Do you feel like it's, I don't know.
Well, to me, it seems somewhat irrational. Now, as a psychologist, I guess I shouldn't be too surprised.
Yeah, no, I mean, I definitely
irrationally
being irrational.
But
yeah, I mean, I agree with you. It's irrational, but it's not surprising. Yeah. It just that people feel like once you feel, because even as you're saying it, I guess I say I'm not surprised by it, because even when you say it, like, Christians and white people, they'll be in the minority, right? By whatever, 2050, I guess, or, they throw out all sorts of different, between 2035 and 2050. And even in me, with all the work that I've done and all the, things I've read, there's still fear that starts to come. And I have to say, you just gotta, you can't give into that. But it's not like I'm wanting it to happen, Yeah. And it's not like I want to be afraid. It's like it's a very automatic response. And I guess that's what I mean. Go ahead. Yeah.
And that's what researchers have found. is that
Yeah.
you can fairly easily provoke those affects, those reactions in people, and you can then get the behavior in the lab. And so if you can do that with fairly minimal provocations in the lab,
Yes.
just then think about the real world when you've got Fox News and some very specific people deliberately trying to make that happen, trying to incite those very feelings because it helps them politically. That's where I think Christian nationalism has a good bit of its power and its attractive appeal.
I agree. It just makes me think. I saw from the, it was either the White House or one of the departments posted a video of this man. They call him an immigrant. I don't know. I haven't checked it, right? So I'm not saying he wasn't. A legal immigrant killing a woman with a hammer on
I
X.
saw that. Yeah.
Yeah, but it doesn't, right? There's no, an X is like the Wild West, right? There is no censoring. There's nothing. But it wasn't like some random, it was like it was the United States government saying, don't look away. Literally said, don't look away. This is what, Biden's policies are doing to your country, kind of thing. And so it's like everything that's being done is to get to that fear part of us that's driving us to a place of panic.
Yeah.
That we have to do something now. And I know that this doesn't relate to our conversation. Again, we've been talking about the Christian nation, but it does relate because these kind of ideas keep coming up. And then that same fear keeps getting flamed. And then the Christian nation, the heritage, that fuels so much of the identity and the drive is people's desire to, I want to go back there. I want to be like that. I have identity here. And so then you juxtapose that, your Christian identity and heritage, with the scary immigrant who's coming to kill you randomly, just on the street with a hammer.
Mm-hmm.
It's a pretty powerful image. They know what they're doing, right? And we have to fight very intentionally against it.
Well, I do think the Christian element, the Christian nation element of it is relevant to here too, in that many Christian leaders actively promote the idea that these kinds of things, killing, all of the social ills, violence, anything that is bad, comes from progressivism, comes from, as you say, open borders,
yes,
comes from anything other than Christianity, as if Christians don't do things like that, as if no Christians, have ever been violent or done anything such as they're lamenting. And, this is part of there's the nationalism part, then there's the Christian part. And so the part of the attraction of Christian nationalism is this Christian leader who's talking about this history that's just like me. These people were all just like me back then. If we're all Christian, then we won't have these bad things happening. We won't have all this violence. We won't have all this evil. And if we could just everybody, be like me and all be, doing the same faith, then that'll take care of the problems in our society. And I mean, we've heard this, over and over again, generation after generation. Yes, and, ultimately, if you're, just think about if you're a Reformed Christian, you don't think that people quit sinning when they adopt the name Christian. So it kind of goes theologically, there's a problem with the whole thing too, just as well as empirically, as well as empirically.
Yes, I agree. And, this is the last question that we have, Warren, and we just love hearing your thoughts on this. So again, thank you for spending time with us.
Well, pleasure.
But this is my last question, and Will just has final remarks. But we're coming to the 250 anniversary, right? That's why we're doing this series. 250 years. What an amazing opportunity we have to be Americans here and live in this great country, which I love. I know everyone on this call loves. And you've spent years fact checking, right? Almost like I'm sure some people, maybe many people that you've had to encounter would call you anti-American, or they wouldn't believe that you love this nation or love God as genuinely as they do because of your work. I am most assuredly not one of those people. I appreciate your work, and I think you're doing God's work, to be honest. But you've been doing a lot of work coming through a lot of attacks, and I'm sure a lot of victories. What does this moment mean to you personally? 250 years. And what do you hope that people start to get right about America's religious history?
Well, in I guess a small way, as much as I can, I want to stick up for separation of church and state. I really think that that's the American way. I think when you go back and you do look at the history, you see there was the Winthrop way, the Puritan way. They came here and they were looking for religious community for themselves. And the dissenters either got banished or killed or maimed. And that's not the world I want to live in. I don't want that for my kids or my grandkids. And I know we're not there right now, but there are voices out there who have platforms who are calling for that, who are calling for state-sponsored violence to keep people into a Christian way. The Winthrop way is not what I want. I want the Williams way, the Roger Williams way of separation of church and state. And if you've read my book, I talk a little bit about my ancestor, John Throckmorton, who was there at the beginning with Roger Williams. And I feel pretty passionately about that I want to stand for separation of church and state in the present. I'm afraid it's being eroded by circumstances these days. And so that's what it means to me. It means to me getting back to what I believe is the American way, and that's separation of church and state.
That is really, really awesome. And I'll just I'll piggyback on what Josh said by just appreciate all the work that you're doing, Warren. And glad to see you again, and good luck on the success of your book.
Thank you.
And to our audience, hey, thanks again for stopping by. This is Church and State, our 250 plus year series looking at the role of religion in American history. And if you haven't already, make sure you check out some of our other episodes. We've done one on Indigenous people, Native Americans. Gosh, we did a really, really great interview with John Fia about, was America founded as a Christian nation? He wrote a book on it. And then coming up, we've got all kinds of other interviews with people who are going to talk about, segregation and January 6th. So stay tuned, stick around, check out our website. We've got a bunch of resources, materials there as well. And always make sure to keep your conversations not right or left, but up. And we'll see you next time. Take care. Hey, welcome back to Faithful Politics, and for our brief little interview with the one and only Sarah Stancorp. How's it going, Sarah?
Good. It's going well. Thanks for doing this.
Oh, so at this year's Southern Baptist Convention, and I'm no expert, but I can read the news, they voted overwhelmingly to advance some sort of formal ban on churches with women pastors. And your book, Damned If She Does, looks at why women are leaving the church and what that means for the future of religion. So I'd love for you just to, maybe give us what's one story that helps explain how a decision like what happened at the SBC shouldn't really surprise anybody.
So when I had the idea to write this book probably over a decade ago, I thought it would be very contemporary and how now we're decades hence. And when I sat down to write the book, I realized I actually needed to start in the 1980s because a lot of the threads that became important in women's lives started then. And I know this mini interview may become part of a broader conversation on Christian nationalism. As I look at the way evangelicalism, how the Christian right has embedded itself with our politics and really turned into a Christian nationalist machine, a big piece of that is Christian patriarchy. The way women are oppressed within this system is kind of a model for oppression of all of us. So jumping back to the beginning of the book, I started with Danuta Soderman, who was a co-host of the 700 Club with Pat Robertson, and she was granted a bit of influence there. She could talk to the country. She could even preach sometimes. God forbid. But she also was bounded by certain rules. She could have this influence if she followed certain rules. And as soon as she didn't, as soon as she was a threat that Robertson needed to dispose of, she was gone. When I think about the SBC, and I think about just year after year, amendments like this come up, attempting to silence women after women have worked so hard to press SBC for reform on sex abuse. This is no coincidence. When I look at that trajectory, and there are still women in SBC, many are leaving, a lot of people have left SBC, I see women who are making some sort of compromise. And they're there, whether it's for comfort or community, or because they're too scared to leave and they know what they'll lose if they leave. They're making a deal, but they're eventually gonna lose. And I think that's the heartbreaking part of seeing what's happening now within that denomination. Is it's bad for the church. It certainly isn't good evangelism. But it's also so bad for women who, the longer they stay and tolerate being treated like this, it breaks them down. And eventually the only way to safety is to leave.
Wow. Well, your book, Damned If She Does, when does it come out and where can people buy it?
September 15th, and everywhere. Everywhere we can get a book, you can buy a book there. It's going to be a big publication day. A bunch of other big books are coming out then. So I'm hopeful September is going to be a good month for dialogue about faith in America, especially in our current political situation.
Yeah. And your website?
sarahstancorp.com.
That's easy. And I will make sure all of this is in the show notes. And thanks again, Sarah, for stopping by and telling us about your book.
Thank you.
Awesome.